by and large, what we want to really focus on is less on the technical end and really more on just kind of applying all the tools that we have. We sit at these conferences and, a lot of tools have been developed. We've talked about drones, which we actually may touch on here. And there's just a lot of tools in our toolbox, but it's understanding those tools so that we can develop a really programmatic approach to scale them to each project individually. 515 Viaduct. We ended up with this project based on, it was an addition to our contract with the Nevada Department of Transportation doing bridge inspections. They had a large seismic retrofit project going on with this project, but they also knew that this viaduct had a lot of deck issues. And so this was an amendment so that they could make the best decisions. So what is the 515 Viaduct? This is the best image I could figure out to give you guys a scale of how big this thing is. Welcome to downtown Las Vegas. So 515 kind of wraps up around the east and northeast side from Henderson, Nevada, up to the Spaghetti Bowl. So those highlights are actually proposed closures, and we'll get to that point in a little bit, but it kind of gives you a scale. It runs all the way from essentially the Spaghetti Bowl to 21st Avenue, which is right by Eastern Avenue. The structure itself, about 8,500 miles long, so not short by any stretch, and extremely congested. It consists of two mainline structures, I-947 and G-947. For those of you who, those two numbers are just a bridge identification number, so it's the way NDOT names their structures. Two structures were built, one 1968, that was the longest stretch. I-947, that's the section that runs from about Eastern Avenue on the east end up towards the Spaghetti Bowl. And then G947 is what continues all the way towards the Spaghetti Bowl and kind of terminates over the railroad there. 3 to 4 lanes in each direction. However, we have about 6 on and off ramps, and at any time we can add an additional 2 lanes in any direction with these. So a lot of lane miles. About 1.3 plus million square feet of bridge deck. So you can imagine that when we start thinking about how are we going to do a deck assessment, a condition assessment of this deck, you can't close all of this. It's downtown Las Vegas. The ADT is, as you can see, about 160,000 a day. And even in the middle of the night, the traffic is not slow, and they really don't want to be interrupted. So by and large, the structure is a cast-in-place box. Really what that does is it limits our access to the deck soffit. There's only 2 spans of precast girders, which you can see here. And one thing, when we get onto this structure and we do our routine inspections, all the data that's in front of you is really based on our routine visual inspection underneath standard NBIS inspections. But realize that we can't close all of it. We're doing rolling closures a lot of times for our routine inspections in the shoulders. So you're still staring across 2 or 3 lanes of heavy traffic. Even when we get a stooper or U-bit onto this structure, and you do have a full lane closure, a right lane and a shoulder closure, you're still looking across a couple lanes. So what this really did is it allowed us, as we get into this, I think you'll see that we're able to collect more accurate data and actually augment our routine inspections. So again, it's just another tool in the toolbox that every couple years, applying exercises like you'll see here, just really help augment and kind of round out a routine inspection. Typical defects with the deck structure, a lot of cracking, quite a few spalls, and it varies in region. And along with those spalls, we had a lot of delaminations and patches that have been done in the past. And you see the last comment there in bold. District 1 down in Las Vegas is out on this structure every single month doing deck repairs, and they're just throwing patches at it and throwing patches at it. They can't get anything to hold. And so that feedback to headquarters is really what kind of prompted a lot of this. The other issue we know from District 1 maintenance before we ever got out there is the variation in cover, or the variableness in the cover from the rebar. So they go out and patch rebar. Sometimes it's right at the surface, sometimes it's 3-4 inches down. So really, what were our goals and objectives of this whole project? Really simple. 1, give NDOT an accurate representation of the true extent of the deterioration on this bridge deck. 2, determine the rebar cover. And when we kind of get into some of the final deliverables, you'll see why this is really important. And we knew this going in. It plays a big role in some of the deterioration we were finding, but it also plays a big role in what what your methods of repair can be and how careful, more importantly, you have to be during those methods of repair. So the other item is the deck thickness, and it really plays into the load ratings. As Nate Harrison at NDOT was going through a lot of the analysis, we knew there was a desire to increase the deck cover over the rebar. However, when they did that, the structure wasn't rating out. So with a lot of the new SHV's requirements, this structure was actually, if we increased deck thickness, was going to have to be posted. Not something you want to do on a major artery in downtown Las Vegas. So our objectives were really pretty simple. Provide the data to NDOT, give them the full picture so that they can make the accurate decisions. And again, I think this is one of those tools that that's really the purpose of it, right? We have a giant asset. The asset valuation on this structure is not small. So as we look at making that best benefit cost decision, we need all the data. And a visual inspection simply doesn't get it to you. So scope and plan, there's some of my homemade devices there, but they certainly were used. Scope of work, high-speed investigation. So this was a great collaboration between NDOT, Staff Bridge, ourselves, and Infrasense. And I do wish Adam was up here with me, but originally he was supposed to still be on his honeymoon. So we'll cut you some slack. But really the idea was do this at high speed. We can't close traffic. I've asked my VSIM guys to give me a model and give me an accurate user impact kind of balance of, had we done this the old school way of shutting down lanes of traffic, going out and dragging a chain across 1.3 million square feet, which by the way sounds miserable, what would that user impact be? And I can tell you that we had no user impact. So with this high speed, determined delamination, deterioration of concrete, rebar levels, very, very important. And out of the deliverables, what NDOT really needed, and any agency needs to put that bid out, we go do a traditional chain drag, how much are we actually missing? Or how accurate are those areas? And do we have an accurate drawing of the exact repair areas so that a contractor can get back out? I think what you'll find is this is a tool that an agency can hand to a contractor and have it be pretty darn precise. And really know where they can and can't scarify a deck in order to do any overlays. It also helps, by this method, the quantities we're able to give are almost exact. And much more exact, I think, than traditional sounding, whether it be by rotary percussion or chain drag, right? Or even beating on this thing with a hammer. So getting all that out to bid really increased their accuracy of estimates coming back. So project approach, huge structure, right? We can go out and do all of this at once, not necessarily the most efficient project approach. So we broke this into 2 phases. And again, it's knowing the tools that are in your toolbox and then adjusting every single project, because there's always a best fit for that project. By breaking this into 2 phases, what we were able to do is go out, collect all the high-speed data at normal traffic speeds. And it worked in our favor to actually do this midday traffic, 2, 3 o'clock. Got a nice full day of sun in Las Vegas. And that traffic actually slowed down just enough that it met almost precisely the target speed that we were after. So collect all this data, do an analysis on it, run back out at phase 2 with some targeted closures to actually ground truth everything. So there's a calibration that has to be done. And by going out, and the photo on the right is actually calibrating the GPR data. So there's a dielectric. We need to know the actual depth. So we targeted 6 different locations, some deep, some shallow. It's always fun to drill into a bridge deck, I'm not gonna lie. Anybody that has a bridge deck you want cored, I'm happy to do it. we were able to go out, find with handheld GPR, locate them, and actually calibrate that data. We also performed impact echo to verify the slab thickness. It was a very large concern. We knew there were some construction control issues. We performed half cell, and I'll get to that in a little bit. That actually proved to be a pretty interesting experiment. And then obviously sounding and visual, right? So there's our two-phase approach. What you see on the right, and I'm not going to read you the ASTM standards. You guys can read those if you really want. What you see on the right is actually a little bit of our ground truthing. So we found a large delamination. We were able to map it out with one of my favorite kids' toys ever. And the little white dots are actually, we laid out a grid in order to perform the impact echo so that we had just a standard map that we followed, almost like a luminosity test in tunnels. Challenges and successes. How'd it go? I will tell you that driving and doing ground-coupled GPR actually works. When you have, on the eye structure, it's about 73 spans of this thing, and so to save Keith the effort of walking all 73 spans, we threw him on the tailgate on him one night on our way out of the closure and pulled him along, and it actually worked. So some of the challenges we had, certainly there's challenges on every single project. During the high speed, I mentioned the traffic. We have shadows from that traffic. It does get in the way sometimes. And the shadows play a role also in, the IR is evaluated visually after we collect all that data. So you can't really develop an algorithm necessarily to do it perfect just because of the shadows, the debris on the roadway. It's Las Vegas. I'm not going to lie, there's a ton of car debris in the shoulders, oil being on the roadway. So some of the challenges, and then on I-947, which is the longest of the structures, the rebar depth is typically in that 3 to 5 range. So we're starting to reach the limit of that IR capability. GPR, I would let Adam explain this if anyone has a question later, but the variable rebar spacing, I think I have an image later in this where right at actually hinge 5, right in the middle on the top, you can see a little variation in how the response data comes back. We also have a little bit of variation in the response, and that is sometimes an indication of chloride content and that GPR response not being as strong. That's what we're looking for. But when we have that variation in the rebar spacing, sometimes it plays with the algorithm that they have and kind of screws up that ability. So unfortunately, they were actually able to, or fortunately, you were able to kind of break your analysis up into various sections because the structure was so standard. The impact echo, this is kind of a lesson learned being up there. Really important to have on a structure like this, really important to have as-builts out with you in the field. As we were taking impact echo, some of the responses we were getting just couldn't figure out the response, right? Deck thickness seemed to be giving funny answers. Turns out we were hitting the chamfers on some of the boxes. So really important to have those as-builts, be able to map where you are and understand what data you're getting back in the field. Had we not had as-builts with us, we would have gone through the entire inspection, collected all the impact echo, and not been able to go back and correlate that data. So really important to have that out with you. The other thing we found, and I'm sure we've all found it, but the tining proved to be a little challenging. Areas where the tining was well worn, sounding either by chain or the percussion tool worked fabulous. The areas where the tining was still in really good shape, some of the shoulders, outside of those wheel paths, it proved to kind of augment that sound enough that it made it difficult to identify some of it. It also played havoc with some of the impact echo. So just important to know. Some of the successes we had. Traffic ops, the way we perform the high speed, the time of day, we actually tested this both during the day for a heat period and during the night, during a cool period for IR. We found that the data coming back during the heating period was much better. And like I said, we were able to calibrate that or time it well with traffic patterns so that it matched our desired speed. And I'll be honest, surprisingly enough, the Nevada drivers actually cooperated. I only had one driver who thought it necessary to give me the single finger salute. But honestly, they were great. We put a vehicle or two behind with full lights. You saw Adams and InfraSense's vehicle up front. And everybody really understood. I think they saw the Google-esque car and kind of wanted to stay out of our way. So the IR, GPR, and high definition, what you'll see in the data that I'll get to is that truly a success. We're able to capture 1.3 million square feet in honestly about 2 days. And the ramp structure on this bridge is very nice. It let us get off and back on very easily. So we just ran a bunch of loops, and very, very easy to collect all this data. Phase 2 approach, I think the collaboration with NDOT and Dave Chase at NDOT headquarters, he wasn't 100% sure on doing this 2-phased approach. We kind of sold it to him, and it turned out to be a blessing. So being able to go out, IR data, when we get to it, you'll see that you can't always depict exactly. So we were able to go out, validate exactly the delaminations, find some that were there that IR didn't pick up, GPR didn't pick up, and vice versa, but really calibrate and identify the exact size of everything as well. And then be able to go back, re-look at all that IR data, and calibrate that thermal threshold. So the data validation, the IR calibration was awesome. And the children's toy is the sidewalk chalk. It's one of my favorite tools ever, washes off quickly, drivers don't really notice it. And I'll tell you, sidewalk chalk also works really well with LiDAR. So if anyone ever we've used it in tunnels a bunch, where we'll go through and mark up everything. You run LiDAR through, it picks up your field notes for you. You don't have to document a thing. So sidewalk chalk. Quick image, honestly, just wanted to kind of give you guys a sense of the data that we were collecting. And you can see that we're able to capture, here is actually another really good upper right. There's another good area where, bless you, where that GPR data is coming back a little fuzzy. We know that we have concrete deterioration right there. But we're able to capture deck thickness, rebar depth, just 2 different locations here for you. Results, deliverables, and ultimately some final conclusions. So you guys can see here this phase 2 approach. We've got sounding going on, ground coupled GPR going on. We re-ran a bunch of these lines in order to calibrate the air coupled GPR that InfraSense ran. And then every time we cored into the bridge deck to actually measure depth, we measured the dielectric with both a handheld GPR unit as well as this unit in order to calibrate the massive amount of data that they collected. So what do the results look like? This is what Dave Chase was after, and this is what gave them the ability to truly estimate this, this project. So top is IR data, and it may be a little hard to see, but if you see little red squares, that's actually what InfraSense went back, looked at the data, looked at the IR data, and highlighted all of the areas. This is the thermal threshold that we went out and validated in phase 2. And I guess a little bit on phase 2 and how we chose, what we chose. One of the best opportunities we had is to choose closures that were advantageous to NDOT, advantageous to the traveling public, to minimize impact, but also we were able to grab closures that were both in really good areas of the structure based on phase 1 and really bad areas based on phase 1. Some of the really bad areas we kind of already knew. But that was truly the benefit of doing this 2-phased approach. Rebar cover. So GPR, this is the map that's created via the GPR. Top is the deterioration. You'll notice some clumping around the piers, and that's due to the construction method and maybe some lack of control, we believe. And then on the bottom half, you see the variation in the rebar spacing. So that red is about 1 inch. Standard NDOT cover is 2.5. So certainly not what we want to see. And if you were to go back and try to mill this deck traditionally, put an overlay, that's an area we're going to run into problems, right? The last thing we want to do is start chewing up all the top mat. So complete opposite end of the spectrum, we have, again, GPR data, deterioration data on the top. Now we're looking at 3 to 5 inches of rebar cover when you're starting to look down at that bottom image. So this is what, if you were able to lay this out along one entire wall, NDOT was able to paint a pretty clear picture of the exact conditions they had that are highly variable throughout the length of the structure. Again, just another image for you. I try to throw up some pretty colors. Very, very shallow, very variable in depth. This is what we don't want to see, right? So a lot of very shallow area. Some of the quantities, so phase one, I realize this is a lot to throw on a screen, but what you start to see is we're able to develop precise quantities, precise percentages, and precise areas of cover, right? So we're starting to see areas of less than 2 inches of cover, less than 1 inch of cover. And I'll tell you, those percentages look a little low, and that's because we were able to go out and recalibrate that dielectric and improve and actually make more accurate all of our exact quantities. So here's some final quantities for you. One thing you'll notice, the G structure at the top is the older structure. It is certainly in worse condition and a much larger problem for district. But you start to notice we're starting 26, 21% of the area. Repair quantity, average reinforcing steel is 232. So certainly we're getting down there. We have some average that is less than 2 inches. And really, some of the stuff where we're less than 2 inches of cover on westbound and G947 is 56% of the bridge deck, and average cover should be 2.5. So what are our results and conclusions? The interesting thing about the half cell, traditionally we go out, we see a lot of this deterioration. First thing we assume is corrosion, a lot of the spalling, a lot of the cracking. You'll see right there that that rebar is actually more or less at the surface, the bottom of the tining. So zero cover, essentially. I think I called it 3/8 of an inch because I was trying to be nice. We ran half cell, and as I ran the half cell, it quickly became apparent that corrosion was not the issue. All the readings were less than minus 100, and it was pretty quick. We actually ended up abandoning our half cell efforts because we realized it wasn't the main cause, it wasn't the issue. So Nate Harrison and I from NDOT were out on the bridge deck kind of beating our heads against the barrier, trying to figure out exactly why this was happening, since it became pretty apparent corrosion wasn't playing a factor, which it's Las Vegas, you kind of expect that. One of the things we know, construction and the construction inspection and or control is certainly an issue. Because of the variable rebar spacing, it kind of confirmed everybody's suspicions. The other thing we know is the dead load of this structure is enough that each span, they designed it kind of to the nines, and each span has a nice little sag to it. And that only increases that live load impact, right? So dead load played into the load rating calculations. We can't really increase dead load very much, otherwise this structure is going to need to be posted. It also goes into our rehab and our repair recommendations. So rebar depth, very shallow, needs to be addressed, but how do we address it when we can't necessarily increase the cover? The other thing we know about the structure is because they designed it pretty much to the nines, it's very flexible. As you go out there and you sit on the bridge deck, especially during our closures, we have enough truck traffic going over it. There's some good amount of movement in the structure. So ultimately, we know corrosion's not an issue. We know we have rebar cover issues, very, very shallow, so there's not a whole lot of resistance above that. We know we have a very arid environment. Mechanical failure is essentially kind of what we resulted on, is just that movement of the structure with very minimal cover. So some of the recommendations, it had to be variable. It's too large of a structure. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach to this. Hydro demo was one of our recommendations for 3 structures, so 2 ramps and the main line of G947. What this would really allow us to do is have accurate removals. They run hydro demo across this thing. We're going to catch all the bad concrete, but we're not going to remove too much. We're also going to limit any unnecessary damage or bruising to the actual bridge deck. One of the problems we have with hydro demo, though, is that if we remove too much, because this structure, the way it's designed, that top flange is pretty darn critical. So we might have the instability problem during a rehabilitation if we remove too much of that bridge deck. Some of the areas we talked to the NDOT about doing some preventative maintenance, HIMWIM, there's a lot of cracking on this bridge deck, so we talked to them about a HIMWIM and or an overlay that would kind of increase serviceability and service life of that structure. The galvanic protection is one that, we really talked to them early about, and they were very interested about the potential for it, and then we found after half cell that it wasn't really a big problem. So it was one of those that we just kind of made the recommendation to have half cell, have a spec written, have it on hand, but only use it when necessary if we did open up the bridge deck. And I guess last but not least is what did they actually do with the bridge deck? Project Neon being essentially right at that spaghetti bowl, they ultimately roped in the contractor for Project Neon, gave them a little extra, they bid it out, and they're actually going back and doing traditional spot repair based on the maps that we were able to provide with very precise quantities, very precise locations, everything tied back to stationing. So that's the way they've finally chosen to go with it. So.